Hello, and welcome to the Empowering Law Firm Leaders podcast, where we'll be talking to experts across the legal sector to discover the mindsets, behaviours, skills, and digital tools that are needed to run a successful modern law firm. I'm Amy Bruce, host and marketing director at Osprey Approach. Today, I'm joined by Customer Experience Director from Insight 6, who helps businesses transform by delivering exceptional customer experience. Shaun Cremins. Welcome, Shaun, and thank you for joining me.
Lovely to see you, Amy. Thank you.
So today we'll be discussing how law firms can transform their inquiry management process to avoid losing millions of pounds in missed new business opportunities. We'll be reviewing the stats found in the Insight 6 latest client journey report and discuss how firms can make a good first impression. We'll discuss best practices to improve follow-ups that increase conversion rates and the behaviours and habits that set successful firms apart. The report, in collaboration with Moneypenny, is titled The Truth About Inquiry Handling, and it shares findings from mystery shopper research across 4 professional service sectors, including 134 UK law firms. The report has uncovered some shocking stats and highlights some areas for improvement to avoid losing millions of pounds worth of potential new client revenue. So let's start by looking at what did the Insight 6 team measure during the mystery shopper research, and why were they the key markers to review?
Yeah, perfect. So the client journey is something obviously we work consistently with firms, all different types, all around UK and Ireland. And every 2 or 3 years, we carry out this kind of bit of market research. It is very much around the inquiry stage because, of course, they aren't notified necessarily that these are happening. These are mystery shops, if you like. So therefore, we can only go through to making an inquiry, make sure it's a genuine scenario that we're making an inquiry about, seeing how empathetic they are and how well they communicate with us at that stage, and how effective the follow-up, which we'll talk a little more detail later on about. So it's really that initial insight into how well a firm handles an inquiry, whether our researchers would actually genuinely feel they would use that firm, how that compares to other firms in the sector, use all that data to bring it all together, and understand whether we've seen any improvements, declines. Obviously, we can see just generally in the landscape at the moment, the firms I work with are very precious, as you can imagine, about the inquiries they are taking in. But as we go through here on the stats, the firms are potentially losing an awful lot of money here, just purely on that, based on that first touch point. Yeah, when we go into detail, it's really as simple as, are they handling inquiry effectively? Are the team understanding why that stage of the journey is important? And if they don't handle it effectively, what impact could that have on their firm and certainly their profitability?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're essentially going into this as a potential new client for the law firm. You're going in that with the idea of, would I continue with this inquiry? Would I instruct that firm based off of that initial experience in the inquiry process?
Exactly. Yeah, that's it. As I say, we do thousands of these a year, genuine, inquiries into firms for a number of our clients, and that can be well, look, it includes hundreds of scenarios as well. So there's no one scenario. We've not gone into the firms with exactly the same scenario to assess it on that practicality. It's around understanding who that firm is, what typical business they're looking to attract, and obviously when it comes into their marketing approach as well. And then really just, I use the word stress test a little bit, because it is that. It's a little bit test to see each of those early stage customer touch points, whether they are really putting effective processes in place. As I do, the team understand it. When we speak about the customer experience or the client experience in our professional sectors, it always starts with the team. We always talk about the employees' understanding and handle of how important that early stage is, and what likely impact that's going to have in terms of the client or prospect, and whether they would actually engage with you beyond that first conversation.
Yeah, 100%. And we'll touch on the first shocking stat that came from the report, which is that law firms are potentially losing £1.34 million per year due to poor inquiry handling processes. And across the 4 professional service areas that you reviewed as part of this research, the legal sector were losing the most revenue. So in your experience, Shaun, what are the quick wins, well, maybe first steps that law firms should focus on to avoid losing that huge amount of revenue?
Yeah, don't get me wrong, there's a number of assumptions in there. We have to assume, so we're based on a 4K average transaction, if you like, or customer value. So there's certain assumptions in there, and there's certain different values within the legal sector versus financial accounting, property. But yeah, it's a startling stat, isn't it? It's one of those things you look at as a big headline number and think, my God, if a firm's losing £1 million+ worth of business just purely because they can't don't have the processes in place to effectively handle that initial stage inquiry. What could they do with that additional potential revenue? Could they handle the capacity of that revenue as well? Is another big question, because often we will have conversations with our clients and our prospects and the competitors of our clients, and it'll be around, well, we are busy, we are handling an awful lot of inquiries. We're happy with our 25-30% conversion rate. We think that our team are handling our inquiries well. We record conversations, all kinds of things that have been in place. But this stat shows that yes, there are a number of firms that are handling inquiries well. But when you talk about how they should handle an inquiry, what their process is in place, is it effective? If they do have capacity issues, how are they handling that conversation? There's 101 different scenarios there that we could again stress test and improve upon. And I think that's what we've found, certainly in this, particularly in 24-25 professional journey that we've done versus 2021 when we last did this paper, is that although the net promoter score, the recommend and refer piece has actually slightly improved, there's still a huge amount of opportunity to improve, if you like, on the overall experience. A really typical scenario I use, I suppose, is the first touch point always comes through to whether it's a reception team, whether it's a secretarial team, whether it's a call handling team. There's all different scenarios that you might come to in that first touch point. But are they really informed? Do they have a process in place? Do they understand the importance? Are we expecting potentially least trained people in the firm to handle our most valuable asset, i.e. our client or our prospective client? And if we aren't necessarily given the tools, the experience, the insight to actually handle that inquiry appropriately, what impact will it have? Because it'll never get to a fee earner, you'll never get to a solicitor, you'll never get to that second stage conversation if the prospective client doesn't feel as though the person speak to understands their inquiry, doesn't feel appreciated or valued. The chances of them calling one firm for one inquiry is very remote. So they're likely to call you, maybe at least two or three others, because we still know the vast majority of inquiries will come through a simple search on an online search engine or Google of the like. So if you're making commitments on your website, if you are saying you are going to be open and transparent and reply to inquiries in a certain timeline, all of these commitments that you do make digitally online, if you then can't fulfill them, if we're not handling them effectively, if our team don't even know they exist sometimes, then we're opening ourselves up to a significant risk. And as I say, when you look at that 1.334 million is a hugely startling number, but give yourself 1% of that number as a additional revenue just for doing what you do more effectively. What could you do with that? How many more team members could you employ to handle these inquiries more effectively? And what would that do to your growth plans for the business, of course, as well?
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight some of those assumptions that you made at the beginning. And the report that is available to download does break down how you've come up with that sum. I do think that's really important. But like you just said, take even just 1% of that potential revenue, and that's a big impact on a firm's overall growth, overall performance, overall profit margin. Just by taking just a 1% of that potential revenue lost in there. And as you said, I think training as a first step is definitely a big win. You want to make sure that the people who are having that first impression, because we all know first impressions count, those people on the front line, whoever are answering those inquiries via phone or via web, are they trained in the best of their abilities, and do they have the tools, just as you said?
Yeah, and is there a cultural fit as well? I try to stress with firms is that it's about who you are as a firm. Some firms are very family orientated, full service law firms perhaps, They pride themselves on their family values, if you like, their ability to empathize and engage with clients effectively. Others are more, I suppose, transactional to a degree. They may only fulfill one of the legal services, for example. They're looking at volume, they're looking at conversion rates in significant detail, and they may be very effective at converting an inquiry purely based on a statistic, but they aren't necessarily the same firms that people would then refer or recommend or come back to. They are fulfilling a task. And that's, I think, to a certain degree, when I look at these stats and when I look at some of the firms we work with, that's what we try to do, is make a point of difference. Is that I use a stat as there's typically 7 times in a person's life where you typically may need some legal support, whether that is, through family, through wills, through property, through all these different new businesses, all these kind of different opportunities that come up in a person's life. And yet less than 10% of those will ever go back to a firm more than twice, because they'll assume they are a conveyancing firm or a family firm or a commercial firm, and they'll fulfill that task and they do the job. That's what I often hear, is they'll fulfill the task, they'll complete the matter. I love the jargon, and I despise the jargon in equal measure sometimes. Is that there's some of the jargon we use, but end of a matter, for example, when we talk about people, it's actually what is the outcome for that client, and especially when we're talking about things like family, and we're talking even conveyancing, and it's an emotive topic. Most firms then will send out a standard questionnaire, a standard survey feedback to say, were you happy? Is there anything we could have done better, or we did particularly well? Now, can we direct you towards a site of our choice to promote us on our behalf? They just miss so many opportunities earlier on in the journey to ask those questions, head off any issues, and really make I suppose, an emotional connection to a degree, so that next time I need support, I know the person I want to help me with it. And if it's not that person, it might be somebody in their team. It may be that brand, that firm that I'm really resonating with. It may be a firm in my local area that I really want to support. All opportunities along that customer journey to really create those emotive links, if you like. And so many firms don't take that opportunity, and that's where a little bit of frustration from my point of view. And that's what we try really to emphasize and work on with our clients directly.
Yeah, I hadn't really made the connection between matter doesn't really make that personal connection, really, does it? And it doesn't really highlight the impact that you could have had on that person's life by calling it sort of a matter. And yeah, I think you've highlighted perfectly. Insight 6 don't obviously just deal with the inquiry sort of customer experience, but you really deal with a full end-to-end of helping law firms really improve in their customer experience overall, because ultimately that leads to referrals and recommendations, maybe from the client themselves returning, or maybe sharing it with others, especially if your strategy is to be very local, very regional. It could have a big impact on your growth plans if you had a bad review out there. If somebody didn't have a great experience and says it to their friend or a colleague or their family member, that could really impact your potential growth in that area.
Yeah, exactly. The jargon is one thing, but I've never come across in all my time, my 4 or 5 years of specifically working professional sector firms, a firm that doesn't want to do the best for their client. They all want to deliver a great experience. They all understand the importance of empathy and rapport. They also potentially look at it as a process, possibly too much. So they'll look at it as we follow a 5-step process, and that will deliver X as a result. And unfortunately, when we're dealing with people, that's not the case, because you and I have expectations are different. We have processes to make sure we follow the right steps, but then we react and engage at different levels depending on the needs of the client. And that's where it does come. Sometimes I'll be asked to do training, for example, on first contact teams, contact centers, reception teams, secretarial teams. These are the first touch point for clients. Almost to try and train them how to be empathetic, which unfortunately I've never come across a firm who can train you to be empathetic. What we're trying to make sure you understand the importance of empathy and share best practices, and maybe bring best practice examples from other sectors as well, which works really well. But also we're just really looking at that that human side of you, that, well, this is a scenario, someone's buying their first property or selling a property or have inherited, or, there's family scenarios going on, divorces, all kinds of things that are saying quite emotive. What we're really trying to dig in and help them understand is, how would you feel in this situation? Yes, we have a process. Because we need to do the right thing, we have to be compliant as well. But actually, it's connecting on a human level. And that's the great thing about a lot of the work we do, is that, yes, this is about the inquiry stage, but there's so many other client touch points beyond that, that you can find. I call them magic moments. You can find opportunities to just exceed expectations. What they might look like will totally depend on you as an individual. What are you looking for? What expectations do you have? What pace do you want to work at? How do you want to be communicated with? All these sort of things are so important. And I think this particular white paper, if you like, or this latest release, is just really highlighting that let's get the first touch point right consistently. Let's make sure we're maximizing the opportunity from a commercial point of view, and then use it as a bit of a building stone, if you like, to enhance the experience at every other step beyond that.
Yeah, I love that term, magic moment. And I think it's really, you mentioned values earlier in the conversation. I think it's really important to connect your values as a firm with the values that are shown in your client experience, to make those magic moments really connect with those promises that you're stating and delivering on. You touched on client touch points throughout there, and we'll come back to that later in our conversation. But another one of the stats you mentioned, the Net Promoter Score, and that's the likelihood a client will recommend the firm to a friend, essentially. Thankfully, the legal sector score has improved. However, it's still at -41, which doesn't feel great. Could you maybe touch on what that means, and then how can firms make a good first impression to increase those chances of recommendation?
Absolutely, yeah. So Net Promoter Score, for anyone who's watching or listening, may understand what Net Promoter Score measures. It's that refer recommend piece, scale of 0 to 10. Relatively simple to understand, in that if they score 9 or 10, they are considered to be promoters. So these are people who are going to go out of the way to recommend or refer that firm, that business. 7s and 8s are called passives. So the vast majority of people, if you fulfill their need, if you like, their expectations, they'll probably score you a 7 or an 8. And they'll go, you've done what I expected you to do, perfectly happy with it. There's nothing wrong. Would I go out of my way to tell other people how good it was? Probably not. And that's almost like the magical tipping point. If we can get 8s to 9s, for example, it is usually finding that 1 or 2 experiences or elements within the customer journey that we've exceeded expectations that tip them into a 9. You sometimes do get exuberant people who will mark you a 10 just because you've done what they expected, but that's few and far between. Anything less than 7, we'll call them detractors. So these are people who may say have not necessarily had the experience they were looking for. Generally speaking, the lowest markers in this are around residential conveyancing. And the reason for that is communication. So the actual Net Promoter Score is heavily influenced by residential conveyancing, and it's one of the most voluminous, as you can imagine, services that are out there. It does have a big impact, because what happens is they go in with an expectation. That expectation of timeline, especially 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 16 weeks, 20 weeks, however long it's going to be, is often not met, and it's usually down to the communication piece. It's not necessarily people making assurances that it'll be done in a certain timeline. It's just not putting expectations in place, and certainly not updating them along the matter so they understand what's going to happen with that. So these passives are people who will probably go and tell at least a handful of other people that they wouldn't use them again. And regardless of whether it's conveyancing that they wouldn't use them again for, they may offer 100 other different types of services. The chances are the people listening to them will trust their view on it, as they would a Google review or something like that. And probably when they're making a decision who they're going to use, they won't go and looking for that firm. They'll avoid them. Whereas in 9s and 10s, those promoters, they'll have had the opposite conversation. They'll have said, such and such looked after me really, really well. I felt I felt appreciated. They kept me updated. They just really delivered something above and beyond what I expected, what would have been effectively a process. So yeah, I'm going to tell again those same handful of people. And we had a fantastic stat to say that If you are a promoter, how many people would that potentially reach? And it was in the hundreds, about 300 odd people it's likely to reach. Because you'll talk to up to 10 people. They will obviously tell other people. Chance conversations will come up, and that will be mentioned as a firm as well. Detractors could reach 3,500 people because actually people share bad news stories more freely than they do good news stories. Yeah, so I don't know. I'm selling a property. Well, I certainly wouldn't use that company. I'm going through this scenario. Well, these are supposed to be very good, but I wouldn't touch that firm because of this experience. The net promoter score is our measure. So we're not only can we see how happy or engaged that client was, but we also can use a bit of a benchmark across the industry. And it's something, and we look at that minus number is quite alarming again. But the reality is, it's heavily influenced by certain services within the legal sector, and even when you talk about property, accounting, financial, exactly the same. Is that it's often very difficult to exceed expectations of a client, and therefore you get a lot of sevens, you get a lot of those passives right in the middle of the market, and every negative piece of feedback has therefore a big impact. When we go into a little bit more detail in a moment, you'll find that the vast majority of those net promoter score points, if you like, were lost on the follow-up. It's because we took the inquiry. It wasn't handled particularly poorly. It was handled effectively. We potentially even got through to a fee earner or a solicitor. Fee earner is another term that we don't like too much, but it's a term that's not commonly used. But there wasn't any follow-up, that it ended there. That's where the journey finished. And if you talk about 60 odd % of the experience is after the conversation, that's where really that's had a huge impact. And that's across all those four sectors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to have the net promoter score be from 1 to 10 and only 9 and 10s typically make a recommendation, that's a lot of movement to get to that place where you're actively having people share recommendations from you and share referrals. So you can very quickly slide into that area of on the fence, not really helping with your marketing efforts themselves, not really making a recommendation, just very on the fence, hit expectations, it is what it is. Yeah, there's a big sort of room for improvement there. Even if you're at 7 and 8, which feels good, you need to be moving into those 9 and 10s.
Yeah, and as you said, the marketing effort is significant there because every firm will prioritize referrals and recommendations. The vast majority of firms I work with will tell me that's where their business's growth is. That's where they get most of their business from. And it may not be a first hand or first touch point referral recommendation. It might be somebody they know. It could be a conversation, local park or local pub or in a friend group or anything, come a conversation, they need this help and your firm has mentioned to me. We record a lot of calls as well, which is really interesting when you listen back because the tone people use on the telephone has a big impact on this as well. So it's not necessarily the words you use. You might follow a process. You might be perfectly fine in terms of what you say, but the person who's making the inquiry may interpret that tone differently to you and I. And sometimes we have that where a firm will come back and say, well, we dealt with it. It was handled effectively. We can listen to the conversation. But the researcher said they certainly wouldn't recommend or refer us. Why would that happen? And now it'll all come back to tone. It'll be, well, I didn't feel like you particularly appreciated the fact I was making an inquiry with you. You answered the question, but you didn't go above and beyond. You didn't find those magic moments. You didn't share a case study with me, perhaps. One of the things we really encourage our firms to do is to relate some kind of legitimate, genuine story to that inquiry. I make an inquiry that says I'm buying a property in this area. I'd like to know that you know the area, ideally, especially the fee earner or solicitor I'm talking to. I've got some fantastic examples out there where the solicitor's spoken to them and said words to the effect of, oh, I know the area really well, some fantastic schools there, or there's some fantastic community or transport links, or whatever it is you feel they would really appreciate. That's going above and beyond. That's telling them that we deal with this every single day. We're the best people to put this in the hands of, to look after you really effectively, and not treat you as a pure transaction and issue an invoice at the end as I say, almost like a process, as opposed to this is fantastic value. We're telling you right up front. We do it. This is the fee we charge because we deliver an enhanced level of service as part of that experience.
Absolutely, it's that sort of you're heard. You've been heard as that extra additional moment.
Yeah, we do a lot of that. Yeah, so imagine repeat back, say the name
Mm,
perfectly. Perfect world scenario. You say the first name. Might not always be a scenario that it's appropriate. Sometimes it's Mr. or Mrs. somebody, but the vast majority, if you can come back and say, oh, thank you for calling us, Amy. Really appreciated your time today. Let me tell you a little bit about any concerns. What concerns might you have? What depends on your scenario, of course. But is there anything else I can help you with as part of this first stage conversation? That means you and I have built up a bit of rapport. So when you call back and you speak to me, I already know enough in terms of the background and your needs, your wants, your expectations to tailor my experience towards you and not be another person that I'm almost asking you to repeat the scenario again. Remind me, what was that about again? And that happens quite a lot. So remind me, where were you moving to, or remind me, why did this scenario occur? Um, there's lots of opportunities to capture that information right at the beginning, so that we can enhance the experience. Another example I use a lot of times is I still see an awful lot of post-it notes dotted around offices where an inquiry comes in, they make a note on a post-it note, they pass it over a desk, or they have a client management system that doesn't get used to capture all the information they need at that first touch point, so they have to repeat themselves. Big bone of contention and big frustration for clients is having to repeat themselves multiple times about the same scenario.
mm.
But even in those few minutes there, there's 101 examples there. I could go on all day about examples, but that's exactly what we're trying to do is just, yes, consider the touch point, but then dig into the detail at every opportunity to enhance or deliver that magical moment for them if they possibly can.
Absolutely, and that's a great example of how tech can play a part in building those relationships and improving that client experience. If you've heard something or if you've learned something from that call, even if it's something personal, maybe they've said they're going on holiday and they'll be in touch in a week's time, make a note of that. So whoever follows up with that call can say, "Oh, I hope your holiday was well. Appreciate you being away," and continue the conversation from there. I think that's a great easy tip and advice to really build on that client experience. And you've touched on there about the client touch point throughout the journey. So the report shares 6 ways to improve the firm's new inquiry process. And the one that I think is most important, and the one we sort of touched on already, is to review the client journey. Really think about how the client is involved, what touch points are there that the client has to talk to you and interact with your brand. So what steps should firm take to review their client journey? What should that look like?
Okay, so it depends on the firm. So what I mean by that is scale of the firm, the size of the firm, how many fee earners they have. There's an awful lot of things that influence this, but early conversations I have with firms tends to be exactly that. Let's understand, have you ever reviewed your client experience, your client journey? The majority will say yes, but there'll be no visual representation of it. So what will happen is they will say, yes, we considered how we handle inquiry. So almost I try to break down, so how do we attain a client? How do we engage with the client? And how do we retain the client? And the retention piece is the full circle, if you like, going back and refer and recommend as well, and retention. So not only them, but their friends and family. Um, and when we think the client journey, everyone thinks of probably 5 or 6, maybe 10 headline touch points. But the reality is, if you do this effectively, you are talking about dozens of them. And what I mean by that, in the attain stage, or that prior to actually bringing a new client on board, you've got to think right back to all your digital assets, your social media content, what your website looks like, what the user experience of that website is. What content do you have out there that's still relevant? I did a piece recently with a client where we basically went through all of their links on their website page from a user experience point of view and found several dozen pages that were either visible or hidden that were no longer relevant. So they were from 2018, 2020, and frankly, they weren't actually even relevant, legitimate anymore. The advice they were offering was inappropriate, let's say, for various reasons, for legal reasons. So it wasn't something they were ever maintaining. But a client will stumble across these as they look to research your firm. They will look at your social media presence and your sites and see what other people are saying on your social media sites. Um, The general public out there, as you know, are far more savvy with digital assets nowadays. They will make decisions based on how they feel you are interacting with them on a digital level. And then they build a picture in their mind as say, once they make that phone call, which still 60% of clients will make a phone call, they won't do it via an online chat or an inquiry form. They'll make a phone call because actually what they're looking for support with from a legal point of view, especially, is something that's probably quite sensitive, generates a level of self-anxiety that's quite high. Yes, there'll be people who are playing on the phone at 11 o'clock at night that'll send an online chat or an online inquiry through, but the vast majority are expecting to talk to you. And therefore, they will have had a look at your website, say, research similar sort of scenarios, trusted people have never met in their life on a review site to believe what they say in terms of how you handle their inquiry or how you look after them when you are appointed. And then once we get them on board and we engage with them, how do we communicate? There's dozens in there as well. How do we make sure, for example, that if it's conveyancing, once we do fulfill that task, is there a card on their doorstep the next morning welcoming to their new home? That's a magical moment potentially. Is there an opportunity to give feedback, but not just looking for review? And that's what we often see is that we'd love to hear your thoughts. Here's our Google review link or our review solicitors link, perhaps, or what have you. When actually our priority should be to get feedback. The review is a bonus, and if it's positive feedback, we direct them towards the review sites, of course. But actually, the real gold dust, the real information we need is just their feedback. You tell us, and it's even better we've asked them early matter, mid matter, and at the end of the matter, so we can really have a true picture of how they felt that experience was delivered. And that's what goes to the retention stage and all those different touch points of referrals, recommendations, repeat business, ongoing engagement, make sure they're signed up to your newsletters, all these sorts of things that are just business building tools that we can put in place to make sure we deliver a better experience than another firm. That's really key.
Yeah, that competitive element. If there's plenty of firms in your area or even just that are appearing on Google that do similar work to you, having those magical moments is going to help you stand out. You touched on right at the beginning that you said most firms don't have a visual representation of their client journey. Is that a good place to start? Get this down on paper?
Yeah, perfect world scenario. There's two approaches really. One, if you feel you've got the skills in house to be able to deliver that, 100% fantastic idea. If it's, the only thing I'd ever say is don't purely rely on the leadership team to do it. And what I mean by that is I'll sit there and I'll be asked to do a client mapping session, and the leadership team sit with me. And the first challenge, well, long before that conversation actually, but the first thing I'll be saying to them is we're looking really for representation across the business here. So I'd need to have people here who are handling the initial stage inquiry, who are dealing with your digital asset. You've got someone in marketing or social media. Let's get them in this conversation because a client map isn't purely about how we handle a client. We need to say pre-client and post-client. So if you've got the skills in house to do that, visual representation, I think, is the best way to make sure it's delivered every day. And what I mean by that is non-client facing areas should have some kind of visual impact to say, this is our vision, this is our values, this is who we are as a firm, and here's how it impacts our client journey. This is why the inquiry stage is so important. This is why follow-up is so important and why other firms don't do it effectively. So we've got a point of difference here. We're talking about magic moments sometimes. Magical moment can be that we just really follow up effectively. And so we'll talk about in a moment, but what does follow-up actually mean? That's very, very different things to different firms. But if you've got that space, that attitude to have that visual representation, sometimes I'll see mission statements, values, but then no client journey. So more often than not, it'll be the first point I'll have with a client, even if they want me to do training or if they want me to do some client experience reviews or mystery shop, if you like, or surveying, any kind of work like that. I'll generally refer back and say, let's understand who you are first as a firm. What are your values? Let me understand what we're trying to deliver. Can we find opportunities to improve that, enhance that, whatever that might look like? Make sure everyone's on board with these commitments, whatever they are. And then we'll go and do the stress testing, if you like. Then we'll go and check whether it's actually working. We'll find opportunities to improve. We'll do the training. We'll have a structured approach to actually delivering the best possible client experience we can, not just stick a sticky plaster over it and say, well, we'll train them on how to be empathetic, which unfortunately, as I said at the start, it's very, very difficult to do. Even down to sometimes I have conversations with HR teams on their recruitment process. What type of people are we trying to recruit? Why are we trying to recruit that type of person? What skills are we looking for? But also what personality, I suppose, and team fit and cultural fit. And too often I still see firms in recruiting because they're experienced, they're available, they're local. And actually, do they fit the culture of the business? Possibly, possibly not. If they don't, that would cause far more damage to the client experience than taking your time to find the right people in the first place.
Yeah, some really great best practices in there. Just recap on a few. So get your client journey actually documented physically so the whole company can see the impact that you have on clients and the process within that. Get multiple people across the firm involved in that mapping journey, people from marketing, people answering the phones, people making that first connection. Look at your hiring process. Start right back at the beginning in order to make sure that you've built a culture that represents these values and represents the promises that you make in order to deliver the service that you want to deliver. And then ultimately make sure that that's all wrapped around in your values and your mission statement, and that really reflects in that customer journey. I think that's a really great best practices there to help firms get started. One of the things I feel most people and businesses just generally forget, I don't know if you've experienced this too, but people forget to review their calling system, their options, or their hold music. A lot of people maybe have had the same hold music for years. Maybe it's really infuriating for clients. Perhaps it's actually really annoying, but nobody has reviewed it or taken the time to call in themselves to see what those options really are. Do they make sense anymore? I don't know if you've got a typical client touch point that people often forget about.
Yeah, it's really good examples actually. That more often than not, when we speak to a client in the first stages, I review them before I see them. They have no idea it's happening. I shouldn't really probably say that here because if I'm speaking to someone in the future, but that's almost always happens. Is I'll go off and have a look at them digitally. We'll do a call. We'll make a call. We'll have a look at the website. I'll ask them usually in the meeting as well to just have a look at their own website, have a look at their own profile, their own bio, all these sort of things to say, what commitments are you making on your channels? And as I say, what does that, if 60% of the inquiries that are coming through are on the telephone, how long does it take? How many rings does it take? Is there an issue with your telephone system, which I've had fairly recently? A new telephone system was put in with a client. Unfortunately, the training for the team of how to transfer internal calls wasn't particularly effective. So what was happening is they were dropping calls left, right, and centre. So inquiries were going in, they were handling them fine in terms of the first stages, and some of these, and the system could record them, so which was very handy from this point of view. And then they just disappear. Literally, the call would get cut. And all it was is the teams just didn't have enough training. They had very, very basic training. The system didn't do what they expected. They thought they'd put them through to somebody else. That hadn't happened and just dropped off the call. And because I hadn't necessarily asked the right questions of, let's just take a contact number in case there's any issue on this call. So I can call you straight back if it breaks down for any reason at all. That didn't happen. So I just lost them. And I had no idea they were losing them. As far as they knew, they were going through to another person until the client called them back and said, I tried to be put through to such and such and it got cut off. And obviously when it happens a few times, you start noticing there's an issue, but that's a bit late then. So we do stress test that. And that's typically what we find is that, as I say, sometimes there's pages on their website, which bios for team that are no longer there. It may be very, very much out of date. It may have no personal relation at all to the person. So it's very corporate in terms of the write-up on the websites, things like that, which means the rapport building piece hasn't started. All you're telling me is what you can do for me. Well, actually, I want to know that you care about what you're going to do for me. And that's really, really important. But when we talk about these dozens of different client touch points, we could probably have 6 or 7 in a telephone call, literally, right through. What's the lift music sound like? My God, we hear some very outdated versions out there. But often the worst ones are the pauses of silence where they use a Zoom system, for example, sometimes where there's, it can be a 3 or 4 second delay that feels like a very long time to a client, purely because the system just a bit of a lapse between the two of transferring calls or answering the call.
Mm.
And often we'll look at that. Is how many rings did it take? We've done it from both sides. Sometimes recent firm again, it rings 3 or 4 times from a client point of view before it starts ringing in the office.
Mm.
If it does take you 5 or 6 rings, therefore, to answer the call, it's taking you 30 or 40 seconds from a client point of view, which is quite a long time when you're just dwelling and waiting. And they are examples of what we look to stress test. And we ask them again to go back and look at their own systems. When was the last time you went on your own website or made an inquiry to your own firm? Because if you make a phone call into your firm, the chances are your number's been picked up and they're answering to you. They're not answering anonymously because they know it's you when you're calling through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely a quick win for today. Everybody should call into their own system and see the experience for themselves. So we touched on phone inquiries versus web inquiries. So we'll just dive deeper into the stats there. The legal sector scored a 66% customer effort score for phone inquiries versus 45% for web inquiries. So what is that telling us, and where is the room for improvement for managing those inquiries?
Yeah, so the biggest difference between the two is, as I say, that initial first touch point. So when you're making digital inquiry, an online inquiry form, for example, there's always a lapse or a gap in time. So when that inquiry comes through, again, more than 80% of online inquiries will come through in non-office hours, we find. So that will be at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night when people are just looking for solutions to whatever their need is. And they are starting to leave a few inquiry forms out there. And the chances are it's not just you, as say, there's multiple firms they're contacting. There's a dwell then that normally say we'll be in touch shortly, which makes no commitment at all. Very, very few times do I ever see we will contact you back before midday tomorrow, or we will contact you back within 3 working hours, or whatever their commitment is. It goes back to the values piece. That for me should happen. If you have the capability, have the capacity, make a commitment and live by it, because that will make a big difference. The chances are the other firms that contacted probably won't be great at that. And if you can be really good at it, you will have an advantage, a competitive advantage right from the beginning. But when those customer satisfaction ratings, if you like, or those customer scores are very much based on when you make a call, you've already started that experience right from the beginning. We've started to build rapport. You do well or you do not so well. You get through hopefully to a person who can help you with that inquiry, who whether it's a fee earner or whether it's another person in the team, and then it goes on to the follow-up. But on the digital side, you've got a step before that. That is, how long does it take to even make contact? We still see far too many firms will get an inquiry and will respond digitally. If the firms are a little bit more savvy, I'll ask that question right at the beginning. So they'll say, how would you like to be contacted? At what time of day would you like to be contacted? Really simple questions that very, very rarely get asked. Because ultimately, if that person's contacting you at 8 o'clock at night, the chances are they might not be available between 9 and 5. There could be working, office expectations. Certainly don't want to take a phone call, but we've never asked, we'll never know. They won't answer the phone, it'll just get lapsed. It'll do telephone tennis, we're going back and forth. Ask that question, would you like us to call you? Yes, you would. Okay, what time of day is best to give you a call? Or we don't want to call, we'd like to contact you digitally or an email or a WhatsApp. More commonly, even more nowadays, people use WhatsApp systems to communicate between clients and fee earners especially. That's fine, that's no problem at all. Systems can generally handle that. Depending on sensitivity, the nature, we have to be very careful as well, whether it's a safe environment to have a conversation, whether the WhatsApp could fall into the wrong hands. There's all kinds of scenarios we have to think through around a communication method. And that's all back to right at the beginning of how they make their inquiry. Ask the right questions, telephone or online. Start building that rapport, that relationship, and making sure that we then deliver to the expectations of the client, not to our expectations. We don't set the standard, they set the standard, and we look to live by it.
What a great piece of advice as well, that the client sets the standard. I think that's really important and plays into the part of your process element that you were talking about earlier, that perhaps we treat it a lot like a process, and actually that is that's the standards that they're coming in on, is their own expectations, that we need to make sure we align with that. And I think what I'm hearing really from that is, and why web inquiries are perhaps scoring lower, is because you've got that extra step, that the disconnect is there. We haven't made that human connection yet. So what can firms do to build that connection early on? And I think having those questions in place, asking for preferences early on, I think is a great way to start to build that human connection. The research also looked at follow-ups, as we've mentioned, and the legal sector scored 14% on phone inquiries and only 8% on web inquiries. So again, a very worrying stat. What are you seeing out there that are the challenges that means firms aren't following up? Why would that be? Why is that the case?
Yeah, I think the really important first thing is to understand what effective follow-up is. And this is a challenge we often have, is that what we measure you on in terms of follow-up might be different to what you think follow-up is, and we'll explain what that is first and foremost. So if a typical inquiry comes through, it gets passed through to a fee earner or a person who can help them. That person will have hopefully a very productive conversation, start building that rapport with the potential client. Will answer the questions they have, will more than likely make a commitment to say, really understand how we can help you. What we're going to do now is I'm going to put it down in email to you, and usually within 20 minutes, 30 minutes, the clients or the prospective clients will get an email to say, really appreciate your inquiry. This is what we spoke about. Here's how we can help. They'll then feel that's the follow-up. They'll go, well, we followed up because we had the conversation, we followed up. And of course, in our world, that's not the follow-up. That's answering, that's still part of the inquiry stage. And this is where confusion breaks down. That's why their numbers are very, very low. If we consider that to be follow-up, it's very, very high, because the majority of firms will do that. What they won't do necessarily then is make any kind of commitment to what the next stage might look like. It'll normally left in the client's hands or prospective client's hands to say, here's a link if you would like to instruct us. Please get back in touch with us if we can help. What else? They tend to be the most typical methods. So you've put it back into the hands of the client to say, okay, now I've got the information I need. I enjoyed our conversation. It was productive. I've probably had 2 or 3 other conversations with other firms that they're all probably productive as well. You all give me information. Now I'm going to make a decision based on what's important to me, which could be price. It could be how quickly you returned that information to me. It could be that the others didn't return information, so I'm going to choose you because you're the only one who actually sent the information through in a fairly reasonable time frame. So you might have an advantage there. But ultimately, you've said to the client, now it's up to you. We've given you the tools you need. Now it's up to you. Follow up to us is, what does the next 24, 36, 48 hours look like? Depending on the scenario, ideally, we'll have asked the question in the conversation to say, there's permission-based question to say, look, I'm going to share some information with you after the call. Within the hour, you'll have this information. If there's anything at all that potentially didn't cover, that questions that come up in your mind, please feel free to get back in touch, whether on email or on phone. However, what I'd love to do is give you a call tomorrow, or depending on what day, time of the day it is, what day of the week it is, just to see what your thoughts are, to make sure you've got everything you need. Is there a good time I can give you a call? If there's not an appropriate time to give you a call, would it be okay if I drop you an email tomorrow just to follow up again, just to say, have you got everything you need to make an informed decision? Would you like to go ahead? Frankly, you might use exactly language, but that's basically what you're looking for, is that instruction piece. Majority of firms, 14% only in our experience of firms, actually did that. They actually went and did that final step, which was looking for business, if you like. And that's where I think the sales word is sometimes a dirty word in the legal sector, that we don't think of it as sales process, but it is. Ultimately, we're here to help and to fulfill a need, and that's a sale. If we don't ask the question and another firm does, the chances are they've got a higher chance of converting that business. And also, clients sometimes feel in limbo, especially if it's a back end of the week. We see quite a lot of it's Thursday, Friday inquiries come through. They've had a lot of time to think about it till Monday, Tuesday. Many of the firms we've spoken to will say, well, we don't want to come across as pushy. We don't want to harass them. These are words I hear a lot. We don't feel confident what we're going to say when we give them a call or we make contact. If we've asked the permission-based question, there's nothing to be fearful of. I've asked you, Amy, would it be okay if I give you a call tomorrow? Is there a good time of day to give you a call? Make sure I fulfill that if we agree to whatever that is. If you say to me downright no, I'd much rather just leave me to make a decision. I've got the information I need. That's absolutely fine as well. But we've asked the question and we've made sure we've got those permissions in place. Um, and 5 working days, 7 working days, 10 working days, it's frankly far, far too long in our experience. People make a decision far quicker than that if they have a genuine need. If it's speculative, I'm going to need some support in the next few months, that's slightly different. But if I've called you, especially if I made an inquiry with you, and this I've told you what I need help with, the chances of me thinking about it for 2 weeks before making a decision are quite remote, if we just think about it logically. But the majority of firms will do that. They'll wait 7 days, 10 days, and then they'll send an email and then never get a reply and wonder why. And that's certainly something we look to enhance, deliver a better experience on. We even put processes in place, which means that if that client then does, well, let's go back. There's three simple things when we talk about this. So, one, does it fulfill a need? Two, is it easy? So, even sometimes we'll put a QR code on responses so that it can reply to an email if they want to. But actually, if they're looking at it on a laptop and they think that'd be quite handy actually to do, they'll scan the QR code and it'll trigger a system to give the fee earner or somebody in the firm a prompt to give them a call back. So we can ask that question, say, okay, well, we're delighted you would love to work with us. What time of day would be best to give you a call? They've got an option to tick in a box. Perfect. That tells you as a business when to make that call. And if we can make it enjoyable, which is the third critical step, even better. And I often get challenged with professional firms across all sectors. Well, how do we make it enjoyable? I worked in hospitality and retail for 25 years, so there are lots and lots of opportunities when you are delivering a hotel experience or a restaurant or a high street brand to deliver that magical moment that exceed those expectations. But every brand out there does exactly the same or tries to do the same. In the professional sectors, that doesn't happen very often. So there's even more opportunity in my world to find those opportunities. And that's where the follow-up really breaks down. And that's why those numbers are quite alarming when you look at them, because what they do is they fulfill the process. The process doesn't include an effective follow-up. It just includes answering the question, sharing information with them, waiting for the client to make the final step.
Yeah, I think that's a great start point, is to define what a follow-up really means and taking that proactive approach. We've a lot of recent episodes on the podcast have been about business development and sales element, and we know that that's not something that law firms and lawyers potentially feel comfortable with. But taking that proactive nature is the only way you're going to increase and organically grow and really have that impact on your business goals that you have, is to actively go out there and ask for that business and follow up on those requests. And you're right, I think a lot of the time clients would expect that. If they've made an inquiry, they're going to expect to be contacted by the law firm, and adding that extra preference area into that, I think, is really important. You touched on earlier that actually getting inspiration from other sectors is really crucial there. And of course, you've just mentioned your 25 years of experience in hospitality and retail. I think that's so important. That's come up on the podcast before, that actually getting inspiration from other sectors can be hugely beneficial for client experience within law firms.
Yeah, exactly. It's fantastic. I love working with professional firms. I work with still hospitality, retail, and other sectors as well. And bringing those logical insights from other sectors makes perfect sense when all of us are consumers. And as sometimes we forget, is that we'll buy from all these brands and we'll engage with brands and we will choose to buy our products from or services from. And then sometimes when we work in our own business, we totally forget all those basic principles. And it takes sometimes other sectors to remind you when you come across them as best practices. The firms I work with, legal sector especially, we try that. That is those elements of personable service, we call it. So it's really right, understanding the client's needs and delivering a level of service, which means you and I are having a one-to-one conversation and you're not talking to a firm because you have your own personal brand. I obviously spoke about things like the importance of personal bios and stuff like that on websites. That is just really important because people buy from people. It's a cliche, it's a very true term. It makes no difference what you are buying, whether it's a product or a service. Ideally, you want to feel as though the money you spent with them, whatever money you've invested, is appreciated and valued. And whether that's buying a new clothing, a new house, a new car, fulfilling a service need, whatever it is, I'd like to think whoever I choose to work with or to buy from um, understands me as a client, as a customer, and understands that my needs are different to yours and to different to the next person's, but you're adaptable enough, you evolve enough to meet the level of service expectation I have for you. And yeah, look across all the different businesses. When you work in retail hospitality, it's hugely competitive. You're always trying to find that 1% level of improvement, or that opportunity to exceed expectations. Law firms have literally dozens of them, because the great thing is the majority, from my client's point of view, is that the majority of the other firms out there, their competitor sets, don't deliver these. They don't focus on it. They focus on the process. So let's find those 1%, and even if it converts, say, one inquiry a month more than you did before, what is that? If we say that average is £4,000, what do you do with that £4,000 worth of value every month? Does that pay for what? You know, what does that make a difference to in terms of your commercial um, output? How does that impact your growth plans? All these kinds of things are really, really important. We didn't touch on so much today, but things like client personas as well, and living and breathing those, because client journey sometimes will go through one persona and track their journey. The reality is there's probably dozens of those as well. We can break that down into um, different needs, different wants, different expectations based on demographics, expectations. There's all kinds of things, as you know, that you can really break that down into the detail. And if you've got people in a firm who understand it, perfect. If you don't, that's when you tend to work with people like myself who will help you understand it and put those steps in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And thankfully, fortunately, that 1% for law firms could actually be really something quite simple and quite fundamental that, like you said, is often forgotten about, and actually we just need reminding. And yeah, it really could be something fundamental that 1% could have such a big impact competitively in terms of your other law firms in your sector. Um, and sort of touching on that, a lot of the research in the market at the moment is showing that firms want to grow organically over the next few years. But based on the stats from this inquiry management scores, how it stands today, it feels like a lot of that resource in marketing and business development and training in that area could potentially go to waste if we're losing a lot of this losing a lot of this revenue and potential opportunities at the first step. So what practical steps could law firms take to ensure their marketing and business development efforts aren't wasted?
Yeah, probably a little bit I was aligning to where there really. It's understanding what your market is, who you're trying to attract, being quite targeted in terms of marketing, and you know better than I do, in terms of that targeting marketing approach is something that has to be consistent. It's not an overnight plan. It's not something we switch on tomorrow and say we're going to target this demographic. It's understanding that there's going to be different client profiles, demographics, insights that we need to really direct the traffic into the firm, which means that we're not wasting a lot of time trying to handle inquiries that aren't necessarily appropriate for us. And what that might mean is, if price point, for example, with the firms I tend to work with, is they aren't the cheapest generally in the market. They aren't the ones who are purely high volume. Most of my clients I work with tend to be full service and looking at enhanced level of service and experience that goes with it. So therefore, the work that I do with the marketing team is around profiling, understanding where those potential clients are, what do they read, what influences them. When that inquiry comes in, how do we deliver the enhanced level of service? All these points we touched on a little bit earlier. There's so many elements within it, which means that if we have, well, that's a question. If you have 100 inquiries a month coming into a firm, which is an assumption we've made on this paper, and you convert 10% of them, is that successful in your world? Have you spent 90% of the time handling inquiries for no value? Or actually, have we started using that 90% of the time to start narrowing down the profile of what we don't want as much as what we do want? Because I'd rather have 50 inquiries and convert 20 of them than have 100 inquiries and convert 10, of course, from both sides, from a cost point of view of handling inquiries, but also making sure the clients who do come through, genuinely, we could help them. And if price point is their number one driver, the chances are the clients I work with aren't going to be the choice they make. So therefore, we look at all the other elements, which is all stems around that client experience. And hopefully it really helps marketeers well in the teams because they don't also want to be scattered gunning, I suppose. The approach to marketing out there, just going out there and trying to attract everybody, that's very rarely successful. When you talk about retail hospitality, you're always looking down at this is the type of client network customer that we want and where they are and what they need from us. And then we put all our resources towards attracting that type of person or those type of people.
Yeah, what I'm hearing there is use data to your advantage. Be really specific about who you're looking to attract, what inquiries are converting, and using that data to really give it an insight to marketing and business development to make sure that the resource, the time, the money that is invested there is spent in the right place. And then equally looking at making sure that you're following that process of the inquiry management to make sure that none of those are missed, all the sort of touch points we mentioned on earlier, making sure that they're followed up correctly, making sure that your first impressions are what they should be, to ensure that, yeah, that revenue isn't lost and that you're putting your efforts and your resource into the right place. And just to sort of finish our conversation today here, Shaun, Insight 6 award law firms who demonstrate that they put the client at the heart of their business with the CX Excellence Recognition Mark. That's a mouthful. What behaviours, habits and tools do you find that those firms possess, those that have been awarded the mark, that sets them apart from others in the sector?
Yeah, it's pretty new in Insight 6, actually. You'd think it had been around forever, but actually we developed this program over the last couple of years specifically for firms that have I suppose, a culture adoption of customer experience. And what that means is they are living and breathing, embedding it into their firm. This isn't a award for the top performing firms. This isn't your 100% marks or anything like that. That's not what it's about. It's about having a commitment or a culture within the firm to say that we are delivering the best possible experience we can for our clients, and we're going to do it through all these different tools that we can put in place, and the client mapping is instrumental to that. We have what we call an ICX6 model, which is where the Insight 6 name came from. So we have 6 steps effectively around understanding you as a firm, understanding the client, understanding how we can adopt and help them, how we can use the data, how we can stress test the data. I mean, it's always like a full circle of support and process in place to make sure that we're doing everything we possibly can to keep it a proactive approach to customer experience and not purely reactive. So over the last 6 months or so, we've started I suppose highlighting the firms that have adopted CX as a key principle in their business across multiple different sectors. And over the next couple of years, you'll see a lot more of this. So this isn't, as I say, unfortunately, something that you can come and buy or you can adopt and say, right, we're going to be recognized by Insight 6 with a rubber stamp of, approved almost. That's not what it's about. It's about working with us to understand your clients, your customer, embedding it in the business, putting the processes in place, stress testing that, making sure that results are showing continual improvement. It's it's a bit of a long-term approach to CX, which then we look to recognise with them or for them, so that how we envisage it longer term is that these firms potentially could even work together. They have a similar mentality. So you are a law firm, you are an accounting firm, you are a financial advisory firm, or whatever you are, private education, all kinds of different firms that we work with. We'd like to think over time they will adopt similar principles and practices, and they potentially could work together to deliver an enhanced level of experience ultimately for the customer.
Yeah, what a great community that will create of people, like you said, have really embedded CX as part of their culture. And that touches on the comment you made earlier about looking at your hiring process. Culture is all about the people that you're building as a team, so that starts right at the hiring process, and of course brings in all those values and that mission statement to bring everybody together, make sure everyone's driving in the same direction, everyone's on the same page, and everyone cares about this. It sounds like a super amazing recognition mark and a community that you could be building with firms that are really striving to do that to the best of their ability. And I think probably a key part of that, you mentioned the term continuous improvement. I think that's key. You can't just embed this once and be done with it. It has to be something that you're living and breathing, that is a continuous.
Yeah, exactly. It's quite a stiff criteria in terms of actually achieving it, and that's why there's actually only a handful of firms so far. There are other firms that we're looking to accredit, if you like, or to add this to. But it'll take a bit of time, as I say, as we bring clients on board. It will be something that we look to address with them, especially one great thing working with the professional sector and legal firms in general is that we find that once they understand CX, once they understand the value of it, they inherently buy into it. So it's a long-term relationship. Very, very few firms do I work with that we just do a one-off piece of work with. It's normally we'll do a bit of baseline, we'll understand a bit of the data to give a bit of guidance. But almost all of the firms will look at it and say, well, okay, what the next 2 or 3 or 5 years look like? So if we do deliver this, what will this have? What's the commercial impact? What's the cultural impact? What's the recruitment impact? It does become a vein through the firm, and that's what we love to work with. And these are the firms that if they have our recognition mark alongside them, these are the firms that we've been spending a bit of time with, or fairly long period of time with. They are invested both financially and culturally, and probably over the next 2 to 5 years, that's where we'll start seeing the commercial benefits that come out of it. So when we think about that network of these businesses, we will hopefully hold things like conferences specifically for accredited firms and what have you to bring them together, because ultimately they've got that key thing in common. We're not trying to educate people on CX at that stage or anything like that, or the importance of it. This is about celebrating what you do and working together to deliver the best possible experience.
Yeah, absolutely. How exciting. We'll keep an eye out for those future plans. And some of those firms that have been awarded are mentioned in the report. So if you download that, you'll be able to see those that are setting that benchmark and those that are already doing amazing things to have the client experience at the heart of their firm. Thank you so much, Shaun, for sharing your experience and your insight into what makes the client experience journey effective, but specifically at the inquiry stage, and how can law firms grow organically and make the most out of the inquiries that they're getting and not lose, I think, £1.34 million of revenue, which is quite absurd. So thank you so much, Shaun, for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Amy. That's been really enjoyable. Thank you.